They found her 100,000 years ago, buried in a shallow grave. Her body carefully positioned, knees drawn to chest like a sleeping child. Red ochre stained her bones. Seashells from 30 miles away circled her head. Someone had walked for days carrying those shells. Someone had ground that pigment for hours. Someone had dug that grave with their bare hands. And here's what haunts every archaeologist who studies her remains. She couldn't have known we'd find her. Couldn't have known we'd care. So why did they do it? Why waste time, energy, survival itself, on the dead? Welcome to the channel, Time Travelers. Before we journey 300,000 years into the past, do me a favor. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. And if you love stories that make history feel alive, hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you'll want to follow where this goes. The wind cuts across the valley like a blade. Relentless. Cold enough to remind you that this world doesn't care if you survive. It's dusk, somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago. The sun bleeds orange across a landscape that would terrify us today. Massive cave bears prowl the forests. Hyenas the size of lions circle in packs. And in the distance, smoke rises from a cluster of caves carved deep into limestone cliffs. Inside one of those caves, a fire flickers. Shadows dance against stone walls that have stood for millions of years. And around that fire, something extraordinary is about to happen. Something that will separate us from every other creature that has ever lived. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's rewind. Let's go back to a question archaeologists have been asking for over a century. A question that sounds simple, but unlocks everything we think we know about being human. When did we start caring about the dead? Not just moving bodies out of the way. Not just abandoning them to scavengers and returning to the hunt. But actually stopping. Turning back. Spending precious time and energy to do something that serves no survival purpose whatsoever. When did grief become sacred? For the longest time, scientists believed it was recent. A few thousand years, maybe. Something that came with civilization, with agriculture, with organized religion and temples and priests. But then they started digging deeper. In 1976, in the Atapuerca Mountains of northern Spain, researchers stumbled onto something impossible. A vertical cave shaft, 43 feet deep, filled with the remains of at least 28 individuals. Men, women, adolescents. All Homo heidelbergensis, a species that lived over 400,000 years ago. They called it Cima de los Huesos, the pit of bones. And here's what made it impossible. These weren't random deaths. This wasn't a cave-in or a natural trap. The bones showed no signs of animal feeding. No scattered remains. No evidence of a catastrophe. Someone had placed them there. Deliberately. Carefully. But it gets stranger. Among the bones, archaeologists found a single hand axe. Perfectly crafted from red quartzite, a stone not found anywhere near the cave. This tool had been carried from miles away, shaped with precision and skill, and left with the dead. They named it Excalibur. Think about that for a moment. Over 400,000 years ago, before our species even existed, someone stood at the edge of that dark shaft and made a choice. They didn't just throw bodies into the darkness. They descended into it. They arranged the dead. They left something beautiful behind. But that question haunts every archaeologist who has ever stood in that cave. Because here's the thing about our ancestors. Life was brutal. Unimaginably brutal. The average lifespan was 30 years if you were lucky. Most children didn't survive to adulthood. Every day was a fight for food, for warmth, for survival against predators that saw you as prey. Time was survival. Energy was survival. And these people, these pre-human ancestors living on the knife's edge of extinction, chose to spend both on the dead. Let's travel forward in time. Fast forward 200,000 years to the caves of Kafsa and Skol in what is now Israel. Here, early Homo sapiens, our direct ancestors, are doing something even more elaborate. Bodies are placed in shallow graves. But not just tossed in. They're arranged, positioned. The limbs are drawn up, knees to chest, like a child sleeping in the womb. Like they're meant to return to something. And scattered around them, red ochre. A pigment ground from iron-rich earth, laboriously processed, deliberately chosen for its blood-red color. Some bodies are buried with objects. A deer antler here. Seashells there carried from miles away. Tools that could still be used, still hold value for the living, placed carefully beside the dead. Why would anyone do this? We're not talking about a society with surplus. There were no cities, no kingdoms, no warehouses of grain. Every meal was earned. Every tool was precious. And yet they're giving these things away to people who will never use them. To corpses. Unless they believed in something we can't see in the archaeological record. Something that existed beyond the body. Beyond the immediate, the visible, the practical. Asterisk, a soul. An afterlife. Memory. Asterisk. Let me take you to another cave. Shanidar, in the Zagros Mountains of Iraq. 1960, archaeologist Ralph Seletsky is excavating Neanderthal remains, and he finds something that will spark decades of controversy. One skeleton, later called Shanidar 4, is surrounded by clusters of pollen. Lots of it. From flowers. Seletsky's conclusion sent shockwaves through the scientific community. Neanderthals buried their dead with flowers. The implications were staggering. This meant Neanderthals, a different species entirely, were engaging in symbolic behavior. They were grieving. They were performing rituals. They were, in other words, human in all the ways that matter. Now, the flower burial has been debated for decades. Some scientists argue the pollen could have been carried by rodents or wind. Others point to the concentration, the patterns, the sheer amount found with multiple burials. But here's what isn't debated: Neanderthals absolutely buried their dead. Multiple sites across Europe and the Middle East confirm it. La Chapelle aux Saints in France. Kabra Cave in Israel. Ahmed Cave. La Pharisee. And not just adults. Children. Infants. Imagine that scene. A Neanderthal child, maybe 3 or 4 years old, dies from disease or injury or simple bad luck. The family has a choice. Leave the body for the hyenas. Let nature take its course. Move on because survival demands it. But they don't. Instead, they dig. They use tools, hands, whatever they have to carve out a shallow pit in the cave floor. They place the child's body inside, position it carefully. Maybe they arrange stones around it. Maybe they speak words we'll never know. And then they cover it. They hide it from the world. They protect it. From what? From scavengers, maybe. From the horror of seeing decay. From the predators that would scatter the bones. Or maybe from something else. Something we've all felt but can never quite name. The refusal to let go. The need to preserve dignity. The ache of knowing that someone who mattered, who was loved, is gone. And here's the most profound part. We found burials of individuals who couldn't have survived alone. People with severe disabilities. Broken bones that healed wrong. Tooth loss so complete they couldn't chew their own food. Injuries that would have left them unable to hunt or gather. These people lived for years after their injuries. Which means the group cared for them. Fed them. Protected them. Kept them alive even when they couldn't contribute. And when they died, they were honored. This is the moment. Right here. This is when something cosmic shifted. Because no animal does this. Elephants may linger near their dead. Chimpanzees may show signs of grief. But they don't bury. They don't ritualize. They don't create meaning from loss. We do. Somewhere in the vast stretch of time between 400,000 and 100,000 years ago, our ancestors made a choice that echoes through every cemetery, every funeral, every gravestone that exists today. They decided that death wasn't the end of a person's story, that the body deserved respect, that memory mattered more than efficiency. They looked at a corpse and saw a who, not a what. And in that moment, in that simple, costly, impractical act of burial, they became us. The fire in the cave burns lower now. The shadows grow longer. Outside, the wind still howls across a landscape that has no mercy. But inside, around the remains of someone who will never wake, a group of early humans is creating something that will outlast empires. They're creating meaning. And that meaning will travel across time, through ice ages and extinctions and the rise and fall of countless civilizations, until it reaches us. Standing in museums, staring at bones arranged with care. Reading the evidence written in ochre and seashells and carefully placed stones. Hearing a message sent from the deepest past. We were here. We loved. We remembered. And we refused to let death have the final word. 50,000 years ago, something shifted. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't a single moment of revelation. But across continents, in caves separated by thousands of miles, early humans began doing something that archaeologists still struggle to fully explain. They weren't just burying their dead anymore. They were performing. Let me paint you a picture. Northern Iraq, Shanidar Cave, roughly 60,000 years ago. A Neanderthal man in his 40s has just died. By the standards of his time, he was ancient. He'd lived with a crushed eye socket, a withered arm, and a leg that never healed properly from an old break. This man couldn't hunt, couldn't fight, couldn't run from predators or contribute to the group's survival in any traditional sense. And yet, he lived decades past his injuries. Someone fed him. Someone protected him. Someone decided his life had value beyond his utility. And when he finally died, they didn't just bury him. They honored him. His body was placed in a shallow depression, carefully positioned. And around him, whether by intention or coincidence, flowers bloomed in death. The pollen evidence tells us that much, even if the debate rages on about how it got there. But here's what we know for certain. This wasn't an isolated incident. Across Europe, across the Middle East, across the contested territories where Neanderthals and Homo sapiens sometimes lived, sometimes fought, sometimes interbred, both species were engaging in increasingly elaborate death rituals. And the question isn't just why anymore. It's what did they believe? Travel with me to Kafsa Cave in Israel. 100,000 years ago, a young Homo sapiens woman, perhaps in her 20s, has died. Maybe in childbirth. Maybe from infection or injury. The cause doesn't matter now. What matters is what happens next. The group gathers. They've done this before, but each time feels like the first. They dig a grave, deeper than necessary. They position her body on its side, knees drawn up to her chest, arms folded across her torso. One person brings red ochre. The preparation of this pigment alone represents hours of work. Grinding iron-rich rock into powder, mixing it with fat or water, creating a paste that looks like blood, feels like earth, and carries meaning we can only guess at. They paint her, smear the ochre across her skin, her hair, into the grave itself. Someone else places a young deer antler across her chest. Another arranges seashells near her head. These shells came from the Mediterranean coast, over 30 miles away. Someone walked that distance, carried them back, saved them. For this moment, for her. And then they cover the grave. Not quickly, not efficiently. They place stones carefully, create a barrier between her and the world above. They're building something that will last. A monument, a memory, a message. But to whom? The ancestors who came before? The spirits they might have believed watched from the shadows? The living who would remember her face, her voice, the space she left behind? Or maybe, just maybe, to her, wherever they believed she had gone. This is where it gets fascinating, because we're not looking at random burial practices anymore. We're seeing patterns, choices that repeat across time and space. Bodies in fetal positions. Not always, but often. But some archaeologists suggest it mirrors birth, implies rebirth. Others think it's purely practical, easier to dig a smaller grave. But then you find the grave goods, and practicality falls apart. At Sungur, Russia, 34,000 years ago, two children were buried together. A boy around 12 and a girl around 10. And on their bodies, thousands upon thousands of ivory beads. Let me repeat that. Thousands. Each bead was carved by hand from mammoth ivory. Each one took hours to create. To make the 10,000 beads found in this burial would have required 10,000 hours of labor. That's 5 years of full-time work. For children who would never grow up. These weren't practical items. They weren't tools or weapons or anything that could help the living survive. They were purely symbolic. Beautiful, intricate, and utterly devoted to death. Someone loved these children enough to work for years creating their burial adornment. Or the entire community contributed, which might be even more significant. Because it suggests something revolutionary: shared grief. Collective ritual. The idea that loss affects not just family but the whole group. That we mourn together. Back to the caves. La Pharisee, France. A Neanderthal burial site that reads like a family plot. At least 7 individuals, adults and children, arranged in graves carved into the cave floor. One grave contains an infant, maybe 6 months old, covered by a limestone slab. Nearby, 3 small depressions in the stone, each containing Neanderthal bone fragments. It looks, for all the world, like a cemetery. A place returned to again and again. A location that held meaning beyond immediate need. A sacred space. But here's where the story gets complicated. Because not every group did this. Not every culture embraced burial. Some sites show evidence of something darker. Cannibalism. At Gough's Cave in England, 14,700 years ago, human bones show clear signs of being processed for food. Skulls turned into cups. Long bones cracked open for marrow. Tool marks across ribs and vertebrae. And yet, other sites from the same time period show elaborate burials. So what's happening? Are some groups reverting to savagery while others evolve toward civilization? Not quite. Mortuary cannibalism, as anthropologists call it, might itself be a ritual. Consuming the dead to absorb their strength, their wisdom, their essence. It's practiced by cultures around the world well into recorded history. It's not about hunger. It's about belief. The point is this: by 50,000 years ago, death had become theater. Performance. Ritual encoded with meaning that varied from group to group, valley to valley, generation to generation. Cultural diversity was emerging. And with it, the seeds of everything that would follow. Let me take you to one more burial. La Chapelle aux Saints, France. 50,000 years ago. An elderly Neanderthal man, crippled by arthritis, is laid to rest in a carefully excavated grave. His spine was so damaged he would have walked hunched over, in constant pain. His jaw had lost most of its teeth years before he died. He couldn't chew properly. Couldn't hunt. He was a burden by any cold calculation. But someone chose to keep him alive. Fed him soft food. Supported him as he shuffled through his final years. And when he died, they dug. They placed him in the earth. They marked his passing. But I think it's because by this point in our evolution, we'd crossed a threshold. We'd developed something that goes beyond intelligence, beyond tool use, beyond even language. We developed the ability to see ourselves in others. To recognize that the old man suffering today could be us tomorrow. That the child buried with ivory beads could be our child. Empathy had become wired into our social structure. And with empathy came obligation. The debt we owe to those who came before. The duty we hold to those who come after. Burial wasn't just about disposing of bodies or honoring individuals. It was about declaring membership in something larger than ourselves. A lineage. A tribe. A story that began before our birth and would continue after our death. The grave became a contract. Between the living and the dead. Between the present and the past. Between the physical body returning to earth and whatever spark they believed transcended flesh. As the sun sets on these ancient burial grounds, as wind and time wear down the stones placed with such care, one truth remains carved in bone and ochre and carefully arranged seashells. Humans don't just survive. We take the biological inevitability of death and transform it into ceremony, memory, art. We refuse to let our dead become nothing. And in that refusal, we became the only species that tells stories about where we go when the stories end. 40,000 years ago, something extraordinary happened. Death rituals didn't just continue. They exploded. Burials became elaborate, ornate, so complex and time-consuming that they began to rival the effort put into staying alive. And alongside these burials, something else emerged. Something that would change everything. Cave paintings appeared across Europe. Handprints pressed into limestone walls. Bison and horses rendered in ochre and charcoal with stunning detail. Abstract symbols that might be language, might be maps, might be prayers. And here's the connection archaeologists can't ignore. Many of these painted caves are near burial sites. Some contain human remains. Others show imagery that suggests rituals, ceremonies, gatherings around death. Art and death, intertwined from the beginning. At Lascaux, Chauvet, Altamira, our ancestors were doing more than leaving their mark. They were creating experiences. Spaces where the living could commune with something beyond themselves. The dead were becoming ancestors. And ancestors required devotion. Let me take you to one of the most haunting burials ever discovered. Dolní Věstonice, Czech Republic. 27,000 years ago. 3 young people, buried together in a single grave. In the center, a woman in her late teens. To her left, a man lying face down. To her right, another man facing her. His hand reaches toward her pelvis. All 3 bodies covered in red ochre. All 3 adorned with pierced fox teeth, ivory beads, and carved pendants. The woman's skeleton shows signs of severe disability. Her spine was malformed. She likely walked with difficulty, experienced chronic pain. And yet, she was buried with more grave goods than almost anyone else from her time period. What happened here? Were these lovers caught in some ancient tragedy? A woman who died in childbirth with 2 men who cared for her? A ritual sacrifice? A murder? We'll never know. But what we do know is this: whoever arranged this burial spent days preparing it, creating a tableau that would last millennia, telling a story in bone and ochre that we're still trying to read. Death had become narrative, and narratives require interpretation, meaning, belief systems complex enough to encode messages for an unknown future. Travel forward to Sungur again. Those children buried with 10,000 ivory beads weren't alone. An adult male was found in a separate grave, laid out in a straight line, arms at his sides. He was covered in 3,000 beads. His clothing would have been entirely covered in intricate ivory decoration. Next to him, a carved mammoth ivory lance, over 6 feet long, made from a single straightened tusk. A technical achievement that would challenge modern craftsmen. This man wasn't just buried. He was dressed for eternity. His clothing, his weapons, his adornments, all suggest someone of importance. A leader, a shaman, a great hunter, or maybe just someone deeply loved. The burial implies belief in an afterlife substantial enough to require provisions. You don't send someone off with their finest possessions unless you believe they're going somewhere. So what did they believe? That question has haunted anthropologists for generations. And the truth is, we can only theorize. Some burials suggest fear. Bodies pinned down with heavy stones. Hands and feet bound, as if the living worried the dead might return. Others suggest reverence. Graves reopened years later, new items added, bodies rearranged. Ongoing relationships with the deceased. Still others suggest hierarchy. Elaborate burials for some, simple graves for others. Social status extending beyond life. But threading through all of it, across every culture, every time period, every continent humans reached, one theme remains constant. The dead matter. They're not discarded, not forgotten. not treated as waste or meat or objects. They're treated as people, even in death, especially in death. Fast forward to 12,000 years ago. Agriculture is beginning, settlements are forming, and burial practices are evolving again. At Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, massive stone circles are erected. T-shaped pillars weighing up to 20 tons, carved with animals and abstract symbols. And scattered among the structures, human remains. Not full burials. Fragments. Skulls. Bones carefully placed. Some archaeologists believe Göbekli Tepe was a burial complex. A pilgrimage site where the dead were brought from vast distances to rest among the stones. A temple. A cemetery. A place where the boundary between earth and whatever lies beyond grew thin. Religion, in other words, built on foundations laid 300,000 years earlier in caves and shallow graves. Every cathedral, every pyramid, every ziggurat and tomb and mausoleum traces its lineage back to that first human who stopped, turned back, and refused to leave their dead behind. Jump to ancient Egypt. Elaborate mummification. Tombs filled with food, furniture, servants frozen in clay. The Book of the Dead providing instructions for navigating the afterlife. To Greece. Coins placed on the eyes to pay Charon the ferryman. Pottery shards inscribed with names. Hero cults worshipping the dead as divine. To China. Terracotta armies. Jade burial suits. Ancestor veneration as the cornerstone of social order. To the Americas. Mound builders creating earthwork monuments visible from the sky. Andean cultures mummifying their dead and bringing them out for festivals, treating them as honored guests. To every corner of the globe, every culture that has ever existed. Humans honor their dead. The methods vary. The beliefs differ. But the impulse remains identical. We cannot, will not, accept that death is simply the end. That a person becomes nothing. That memory holds no weight. And here's what's profound. This belief, this refusal, this insistence that the dead still matter, might be the most human thing about us. It's certainly the most universal. No culture has ever been found that treats its dead with complete indifference. Even societies that practice sky burial or cremation or exposure to the elements do so with ritual, with meaning, with purpose. We've been doing this for so long that it's written into our DNA. Grief is biological. Mourning is neurological. The pain of loss activates the same brain regions as physical injury. We're built to care about the dead. And perhaps that's the answer to the question we started with. Why would our ancestors, living on the edge of survival, waste precious resources on corpses? Because it wasn't waste. Burial rituals created social bonds. Strengthened group cohesion. Established traditions that gave communities identity and purpose. Caring for the dead meant caring for each other. And tribes that cared for each other survived better than those that didn't. Compassion became an evolutionary advantage. But I think it's more than that. More than cold evolutionary logic. I think somewhere in the vast stretch of time between the first burial and today, our ancestors discovered something that transcends survival. Meaning is more important than existence. That life without memory, without legacy, without connection to those who came before and those who come after, isn't really life at all. It's just biology. Just chemistry. Just atoms arranging themselves randomly until they stop. And we refuse to accept that. So we bury. We build monuments. We carve names in stone. We tell stories. We light candles. We visit graves. We say their names out loud. We remember. And in remembering, we declare that they were here. That they mattered. That the universe is different because they existed. That death doesn't get the final word. From that first grave in Cima de los Huesos to the cemetery down your street, the message remains the same. Written in bone and stone, ochre and flowers, pyramids and headstones. Asterisk, we were here. We loved. We remember. Asterisk. And love, somehow, survives death. The caves are quiet now. The fires have gone cold. The people who painted those walls and buried their dead with such care have been dust for millennia. But their message endures. Every time we attend a funeral, we're performing a ritual 100,000 years old. Every time we visit a grave, we're honoring a tradition older than civilization. Every time we refuse to forget, we're continuing a conversation that began before words existed. We are the echoes of their choices, the inheritors of their compassion, the proof that their grief, their love, their refusal to abandon the dead meant something. It meant everything. And it still does. If this journey through time moved you, if you felt the weight of those ancient hands laying loved ones to rest, if you heard the echo of our ancestors calling across millennia, don't let it end here. Subscribe. Share this story. Let others discover the profound moment when we became human. Because these aren't just dusty bones in forgotten caves. This is your story. Our story. The story of every person who has ever looked at death and chosen love instead. Hit that like button if you believe memory matters. Comment below with what you think our ancestors believed about death. And join us next time as we explore more forgotten chapters of our shared past. Because the story of humanity? It's too important to forget.